This video is brought to you by patreon.com/worsttake. Get access to exclusive live streams and Discord servers, on-screen shoutouts, and early access to some videos when you join now. Help make sure that we can continue to make content like this by supporting the Patreon. Links are in the description down below. Kade York is back on the Browns. There's also a update on the DeShaun Watson injury. We're going to talk about Ronnie McLeod coming back to the Cleveland Browns as well, and this stupid hip drop rule and why it might be something that affects the Browns more than other teams. My takes on all of those topics will be coming up. But first, let's talk about the Browns bringing back Kade York. Now, if you've been a watcher of this channel for any time, you would know that me and Kade York have an interesting history on my feelings of him. Now, I tend to think that people confuse my feelings on the philosophy of drafting kickers and Kade York as the same. But let me reiterate. I think it's a dumb idea to draft a kicker. Not because the kicker you might draft won't ever end up being good, right? There's a good chance that whoever you draft will eventually be good. But the key word there is eventually. Yes, that kicker might be good, but it's probably not going to be on the team that drafted him. Kickers are, for whatever reason, volatile, especially early in their career. They can have great swings of excellence. They can have horrendous swings of mediocrity. We saw this take place with Austin Seibert, Zane Gonzalez, and now Kade York. Pretty sure there's other guys we can add to that list, but those are three at the top of my head, and it's three too many. I have this line of thought when it comes to drafting kickers. When you draft a kicker, you usually make yourself look bad for drafting a guy who you're going to cut, and you usually make another team look like a genius. It's a lose-lose-lose, except for the team that picks him up second. Now, this is an interesting situation with Kade York. The Browns have already given up on Kade York. The Browns have already moved on from Kade York, which might be the best thing to ever happen to Kade York, and it might be a way for this whole thing to actually work out for the Cleveland Browns. Because, yes, while Kade York bombed in the preseason last year, he did it in the preseason, which means for the Cleveland Browns, it didn't cost you any games. You went and got Dustin Hopkins. Since you have Dustin Hopkins, there is no pressure on Kade York to kick whatsoever this year. Look, he's probably going to get in the kicking competition. It's not going to be anything that's real. He's going to be put on the practice squad. We're going to house him for a year. And then when Dustin Hopkins' contract is up, you might be able to go back to Kade York, because at that point, he's not going to be a super young kicker. He's going to have time to figure out whatever his process needs to be, and maybe that's a situation to where he could be more consistent and live up to his potential as a fourth-round draft pick. The Browns have put themselves in position to somehow be the second team to use Kade York after somebody drafted him, which is rare. I will say that. And I do think that there's a chance that works out. We've seen this again. Zane Gonzalez is a perfect example of this. Horrible kicker in Cleveland, cost you a game and cost you like multiple games in Cleveland. Gets cut, goes to Arizona, he's fine. Now, you bring Kade York back. He's had a year to kind of detox and flush whatever happened last year down the system. You get him in camp. If he sucks, he's gone. If he's okay, you keep him on the practice squad, and it's really a virtually no-risk move. The only thing is you could have saved yourself a fourth-round draft pick and just did this with Kade York if you let somebody else draft him. But nonetheless, you are here anyways, which is better than nothing. So I actually don't mind the move to get Kade York. I think it's fine. And it will be either consequential in the positive way or inconsequential at worst. So not really a big take there for the Browns bringing back Kade York. They also brought back Ronnie McLeod. Kind of similar vibes here. Good locker room guy, good rotational guy. You know that Juan Thornhill had issues with injuries, so you want to make sure that that safety room is deep. And it's not just this year that Juan Thornhill has had issues with injuries. It's pretty much been his MO or his kind of downside his whole career, is his injury rate. So yeah, make sure you have somebody there. Also, Grant Delpit, not somebody who's been great at avoiding injuries there. So, you know, you already have Ronnie McLeod. You already have Ronnie Hickson, and now you could also add D'Anthony Bell to that. So you have great depth in that safety room. I think that's a fine move to pick him up as well. I know a lot of people were concerned if DeShaun Watson was going to be back, with the Browns signing Tyler Huntley and Jameis Winston was a sign that Deshaun's rehab isn't going well. I always can we just, before we get into this, can we stop speculating on injuries based on nothing? We're doing this really bad with Nick Chubb as well. We did this with DeShaun Watson last week. But people, I have seen the timeline go from Nick Chubb might be back from camp to, well, Nick Chubb's going to be back for week 1 to Nick Chubb might be back for week 8. All of these projections have happened with absolutely no medical updates whatsoever. Nick Chubb and his camp haven't released a damn thing about that injury. Yet I've seen people go as wild as he's going to be back from camp to he's going to miss 8 weeks. We don't know. The Browns said he's going to be back for week 1 this year. They expect him back from week 1. That's where we should be at. I don't know why we're going all up and down trying to speculate because they signed a backup running back when they've always carried 3. So it's a little silly to me. And then people thinking Tyler Huntley was oh, well, now they know, that Deshaun's not healthy because they signed Tyler Huntley. I don't know. I didn't really agree with that line of thought either. From Mary Kay, she says, by all accounts, Watson is in a great spot in his rehab, on track to start the season. He'll be in Cleveland for most of the offseason program, which begins in April 15th, and 2 weeks of conditioning, run through mandatory minicamp in June. The Browns won't rush Watson, but he's expected to throw in organized team activities, which includes 11-on-11s and the minicamp. So he's going to be back for OTAs, throwing the football. So he's the injury process, he's fine. I would like to remind people too, Watson had 2 separate injuries to that throwing shoulder. I know people tend to panic when you hear throwing shoulder, but the concerning injury that DeShaun Watson had, that bruised rotator cuff, he came back and played 2 games with that injury. The injury that took him out is a broken bone in his shoulder, which from all accounts, pretty much a more simple rehabilitation process that'll get him on the field by OTAs. So, I mean, you're talking about him having a full spring. That's really, really good news if you're the Cleveland Browns, especially considering the fact that you have this new offense that you're trying to do, or this adjusted offense that you're trying to implement. You want him to have those spring snaps. You want him to get that chemistry with Jerry Jeudy, and him being able to play 11-on-11s, 7-on-7s, and a mini camp and throw. Very important. Very, very good update there for the Cleveland Browns. The last thing we're going to talk about is this stupid hip drop rule tackle. They made it a rule. It's official. It was unanimous by the competition committee. And I don't want to go and argue about the merits of the rule. I think there's enough people debating that. If you want my quick Spark Notes take on it, I think the NFL has a couple of issues, and this does nothing to solve it. So the NFL has a big issue with trust within fans. I think more and more people are becoming more and more skeptical about the fairness in which the game is officiated and called. People think the shit's rigged, and that's a problem, because while I don't think it's rigged, they're leaving a lot of doors open for people to think that. And the more of these subjective calls that have impact on the game continue to happen, the more people are going to think it's rigged, especially when you have more ways that you can call it, right? It's one thing if we're calling a face mask. You can look and prove a face mask. And I think something that came out the committee, not to just completely rail on them, I think they said that they're going to allow the replay official to be able to review personal foul penalties to confirm them before they're implemented on the field. So that's good. That's a really good move. But honestly, it's a Band-Aid on a bigger problem. And I think the bigger problem is we're asking these referees to make way too many subjective calls in a game. And that is the big issue, right? The more subjective calls you have, the more it's going to be, by nature of it being subjective and very consequential to the game, controversial. And the more controversy you have over this, the more anger, the more disenfranchised fans feel, and the more and more people start to feel like the system isn't working right or it's rigged or something like that. And that's when you start to kind of run into like real worries of the institution of the NFL crumbling in upon itself. So while that's a far ways away, and I'm not trying to say the NFL is going to crumble in a couple of years because of this, no, it's going to be fine, but it's just another thing that could add to a list of things that people are already sick of, and they got to, at some point, mitigate that. And this does not mitigate. Just the thought of it makes people upset. Now, as far as like how this is going to impact the Browns, I am concerned. The Browns have a lot of smaller players who do run fits, more so than other teams, right? We asked Grant Delpit to do run fits. We asked Greg Newsome to do run fits. We asked, even our linebackers are smaller. And I wonder if a rule change like this, if the consequence of this rule change, is it going to be that linebackers and defensive backs have to be bigger? Because if you take away pretty much any weight, a smaller player can tackle a much bigger player, then the solution seems obvious to me that you just have to get bigger players. The Browns are a team that's fast, but smaller at linebacker, safety, and corner. Now, they're lucky in some areas where like Grant Delpit, technically fast, small, but he's 6'2". But you play him like a linebacker and he's only 215 pounds. So technically fast, small, but not fast, small. But you know what I'm saying. The Browns have a lot of guys who would utilize a hip drop tackle that are going to constantly be in position to hip drop tackle because they are undersized, very fast, athletic, and make plays along the sidelines where this is more likely to happen, or make plays in the open field where this is more likely to happen. So I am worried about that. But I do think the one thing the NFL defenses have on their side is that they've been continuously victimized by the NFL's competition committee. So they are used to adapting. It's funny that scoring has gone down in the last couple of years, despite all of the rule changes that the NFL has tried to implement to make that not be the case. And I think they're running up against an affluenza problem on the offensive side of the ball, which is you have given so much to the NFL offense that the NFL offense doesn't know how to adapt or doesn't need to adapt. They don't evolve. They're much slower to innovate on that side of the ball because why? On the defensive side of the ball, you have to innovate because they constantly take things away from you. They're going to take too high safety away from you eventually, right? It's a constant game of innovation. Think about what you can do to stop a defensive beast legally, like Myles Garrett, versus what you are allowed to do if you're a corner and you're trying to guard Calvin Johnson in his prime. Right? You're allowed to hold Myles Garrett. You're allowed to grab Myles Garrett. You're allowed to hug Myles Garrett without a penalty being called. Hell, you could jump off and false start versus Myles Garrett. They ain't going to call that. But what can a DB do to even all of that to even the odds with Myles Garrett? That's what it's all about, right? They're going to let all that slide because they want to even the odds of an offensive tackle trying to block Myles Garrett, because if you don't let those guys do that, they think Myles going to get to the quarterback every time and you ain't going to have no offense. But if you're a defensive back and you're similarly outmatched and you see Calvin Johnson in front of you, I know some of y'all might not be familiar, but Calvin Johnson's like the freakiest athlete to play wide receiver in a very long time. So Calvin Johnson in front of you. You ain't allowed to hug Calvin Johnson. You ain't allowed to hold Calvin Johnson. You're not allowed to push Calvin Johnson to the ground. Like, you have no way of evening those odds with Calvin Johnson. So the DB just has to be better, right? Offensive tackle, if they want to get better against Miles, they can just cheat. Ain't no innovation in cheating. Meanwhile, defensive backs got to figure out different techniques. And the second they figure out a new technique, they take that technique away. They're digging themselves into more of a hole, because I don't think this is going to solve the problem of putting more points on the board for NFL offenses. If you want NFL offenses to score the ball, take the handcuffs off. Take the training wheels off. Let them be innovative. But in order for them to be innovative, they need to have to innovate. Right? Like, necessity is the best source of innovation, is basically what I'm trying to get to. And the NFL offense hasn't had the necessity to innovate in 20 years. Of course it's the same shit. Of course it's evolving very slowly. Because why? Why would it evolve fast? For what? So that's a big thing. I'm concerned about the hip drop rule when it comes to the Browns, because we do got a lot of smaller guys there. But I don't think the hip drop rule is going to be as impactful as people's irritation over more and more legislation on the defensive side of the ball that seems to be targeted not at player safety, but at limiting defensive impact on the game. And I don't think that's a smart move. And even if that's not, like, even if the competition committee sincerely thinks that this is going to make the game safer, you have to ask yourself, is it worth it? Because they're really losing the public trust game. And this move is just one that makes people mad off principle. But we'll see what they do. And we'll see what continues to happen. And we'll see how the hip drop rule comes into effect and what it doesn't. Hell, all it's going to take for people to like the hip drop rule is for a hip drop rule to help their team win. Let's keep it real with that too. If the hip drop rule gets the Browns to the AFC Conference Championship game, we're not going to be as critical of it, are we? We might, pass and be like, oh man, it sucks, but we're not about to give back that conference championship berth. So that's the diabolical part of all this. But let me know what you think in the comment section down below. Y'all have a great day. Have an even better night. Peace.